Michael, I'm sorry, I rushed you.
This conference will now be recorded.
No, not at all.
We are now live streaming Dr. Schottenstein. We're good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And good morning. The FSMB Recommendations Review Committee will come to order with the following members present. Dr. Rothermel.
Present.
Dr. Safran.
Present.
Mr. Giacalone.
Here.
Dr. Feibel.
Here.
Dr. Feibel. Oh, thank you. And myself, Michael Schottenstein. May I please have a motion to approve the February 10th, 2021 minutes as drafted?
So moved.
Dr. Safran and
Second, Giacalone.
thank you so much. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Thank you all. So the agenda for today is to discuss our vision and our goals regarding the establishment of a quality assurance committee. We may recall that the governor's working group recommended that we implement a practice of quality assurance to ensure that sexual misconduct complaints are being appropriately managed. Specifically, it was envisioned that the medical board would review a meaningful percentage of the decisions made by the secretary and supervising member to either close a sexual misconduct case without investigation or to close a case after investigation but without referral for enforcement. So our thought was to reestablish a quality assurance committee in order to facilitate this review. Regarding the goals of the committee, they would be, first, to add a layer of redundancy to our review process in order to maximize the odds that we identify any flaw in our process which causes us to erroneously close cases. In that regard, if we should spot any pattern of concerning decisions, it gives us the ability to catch that in a timely manner and make course corrections as needed. Second, to give the public reassurance as to our resolve in this regard. And third, to facilitate a more direct level of board member involvement in the process, thereby increasing the understanding of board members as to the factors involved in the decision to close a case. And that should in turn improve the comfort level of board members with the process and hopefully provide reassurance that our system is working as it should. So we have a few decisions to make today regarding the mechanics of the committee. Before we proceed with that, is there anything, Stephanie, that you'd like to add?
Nothing to add on my end. Well said.
Okay, thanks. Any other discussion before we move on? Okay, so if you'd be so kind, maybe we'll go to our first decision point, right? Which is, what's the sample size that we would like to be reviewed each month? And so we see categories listed for review: enforcement disposed, standards review disposed, investigated disposed, licensure and renewal disposed. So the previous Quality Assurance Committee took a random sample of 5%. Of the categories selected, that would yield about 10 complaints for review each month. Any discussion regarding that?
Well, I have a discussion. I thought we were only thinking about reviewing sexual misconduct versus all of the different complaints that we close or pursue every month.
Sure. So I think that we were talking about sexual misconduct cases, but when they're closed in these different categories.
I'm sorry. What is that? I think Dr. Safran was asking if it's limited to, it appears that it's open to more than just sexual misconduct. It's
Right. And I thought it was only sexual misconduct.
So
Agreed to, I thought.
it's my understanding as well. Stephanie, am I misunderstanding?
So I believe the previous conversations relative to narrowing the category down to sexual misconduct were relative to the involvement of the consumer member in the closure process. We have not had a substantive discussion yet on the quality assurance. We previewed the data, I believe, 2 meetings ago. 2 months ago. I don't think we've talked about the details of what quality assurance will do yet. So that was relative to the introduction of the consumer member.
Oh, okay. I guess I sort of had thought we'd landed on staying with sexual misconduct. Dr. Feibel?
And I have to tell you, I have a real discomfort with only doing sexual misconduct. I don't think we need to do licensure and things like that, but I have a real concern about standard of care and how those cases are adjudicated and disposed of. So I think it would be a real mistake on our part given the fact that we're reestablishing this committee, to not do a little more legwork and at least add those cases into the mix.
So, Ms. Montgomery.
I realize I'm not a member, but the proposal is that enforcement dispose, standards review, investigations disposed, and licensure renewal disposed. I don't know what else is not included with, I think it's, is it all of our work except, or what isn't included in those categories? And that's what's been proposed. And frankly, I would agree with Dr. Feibel that if you're going to do quality assurance, you might as well do quality assurance of your entire book of business rather than just, albeit sexual misconduct is really important, but so is standard of care and et cetera.
So I think it's all important, of course. I think that there's a question of resources. I think when I had looked at these categories to be reviewed, my thought was that we were going to start with sexual misconduct and then expand from there, depending on how that goes. I know that when the governor's working group made its recommendation for quality assurance, it was with regard to sexual misconduct. So not to say certainly that we can't do more, but I think that we had a discussion about, the concern that, from a manpower, and time standpoint, maybe we would be right to start with the sexual misconduct cases, and then potentially proceed from there. Any other discussion on the matter? Mr. Giacolini?
I would just add, we only receive about 100 sexual misconduct complaints a year. So the numbers we've previously talked about have not been just restricted to sexual misconduct. I would say the other piece of this that we've built in on the front end are so many processes on the sexual misconduct that if we're limiting, I'll just be frank, if we're limiting the scope of the quality assurance to sexual misconduct, we are overweighting our focus on just the work of the board on sexual misconduct. We would have front layers that we've built in with staff, then we would have the introduction of a consumer member, and then we would have a quality assurance committee dedicated to just sexual misconduct, with everything else having no adjustment or kind of, broader view. So I would say that I would just recommend that I think limiting it to the sexual misconduct is too narrowly focused.
And the other thing with the consumer member, I don't know why you would exclude the consumer member from any of the quality, not just sexual misconduct, because we would have an interest in what cases the investigation disposes of and what kind of standards review has been disposed. Now, I grant you that we don't have the expertise on standards of care, so it might be you exclude us from that. But it seems to me you give the consumer member as much engagement for public protection as possible.
So, Stephanie, my understanding, right then, we're contemplating the consumer member being part of the process for sexual misconduct cases only with regard to what we're envisioning as an investigations review committee, but contemplating a more expansive caseload for quality assurance. Is that sort of what we're thinking?
Correct.
Okay. And in that regard, are you comfortable just sort of having a random sample of all of our cases, or limiting it to things like sexual misconduct and minimal standards?
I think we would pull everything, right? Because it really will somewhat shake itself out in the categories from which we're pulling. So when we pull from standards review disposed, it's likely going to pull minimal standards cases. If we pull from investigations disposed, it could be from prescribing standard of care types of issues, sexual misconduct. It could be a wide variety of things. Same with enforcement. So I think that it would really run the gamut. I want to circle back quickly to one of Ms. Montgomery's questions on what is not included. That's a really good question. What's not included are our protocol closed cases or complaints. So we have a host of protocols, and Dr. Rothwell and Dr. Safran may be able to articulate this a little bit better than I can, but
it's not our job. It's the category. It's not our job.
Right. We receive thousands of those complaints a year. We don't have jurisdiction. It's a billing issue. It's an office hours issue, those sorts of things. And we protocol close those. So those categories would not be pulled. These would just be those that have reached some level of staff review.
Thank you.
Great. Dr. Bechtel, thank you.
Yeah, yes, I agree. I think the quality control is so important. And I think with the FSMB audit and the Strauss investigations, I think it's a really critical step for the board to move forward. And I think it should be all encompassing, not just restricted to sexual misconduct, but everything, and especially standards of care. But I think that's really the direction we need to move forward, to really have a lot of transparency with the public and security in our decision making. And it's just really important to look back. I'm really not sure why this process stopped in 2002 or whatever. I think it's a really important component of every board. And I think being all encompassing and moving forward is really important.
That's great. Everybody's comfortable with that, it sounds like. Yes? Okay, Mr. Giacalone?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand what is the volume here between the addition of the closing the cases on the front end and now this audit review on the back end. I mean, what are we talking about per month so that we're all aligned? Do we do how many cases?
Well, so I think there's
volume coming through because that's going to impact the consumer members, right?
So I think there's
physicians, okay, but we get the secretary and supervising members piece and the audit committee. So I'm just trying to understand what is the time commitment here.
right. So I think there's two different questions, right? One is, and we still ideally are going to make this decision today, what's our sample size that we're going to review each month? And the second question is, from what volume of cases do we draw that sample size? So on some level, really, if we're not going to, let's say, make this all about sexual misconduct, our sample size can be as big or small as we want it to be. And really what's going to determine the manpower requirement is going to be our selection of samples per month, right? Or per period of review, I should say. So that's really sort of, I think, where the action is in terms of the manpower issue is what's our sample size? How many charts do we feel like we want to review at a time? Ms. Montgomery, did you have a...
See, why do we, I was envisioning perhaps a quarterly review rather than a monthly review.
Right, maybe, sure.
Answer Mr. Giacalone's question. Mm-hmm. And our focus on, as in any audit, if a closure audit, it would be to go fishing in the pond that has the most fish. So you choose your priority categories and in a quarterly, perhaps in a quarterly way or whatever way the committee decides, but that might answer Mr. Giacalone's question, I guess.
Sure. So if I'm understanding right, the previous committee, took a random sample of 5%, which, as I'm understanding, is about 10 complaints per month, according to our memo here. So, Stephanie, is that sort of what you envisioned, like a 10 chart per month kind of process, or were you thinking more on a quarterly basis?
So I don't have any preconceived notion on the timing of how often it happens. I think regardless of quarterly or monthly, I think we would pool the cases monthly. And if we pooled the 5% monthly, it would, of closed cases, it would be about 10 a month. Now, the way the previous, and I'm jumping ahead here a bit, but the way the previous committee worked, members looked at them singularly. So if you had 5 members on the committee, each committee member looked at, and there were 10 to pool, each committee member looked at 2 and then did and the reason I believe for that, we're really short on the minutes and on any sort of documentation from that committee. But I believe the reason was that cases were recommended for reopen, and then those reviewers then had to recuse going forward. So on the previous tool, there was a box that could be checked to say, do you recommend this for reopen? And then obviously that person would be recused. So as the entire committee reviewing all 10, we would run into challenges if we found something that was egregious that needed to be reopened. We may not have quorum for vote.
Well,
Okay. Mr. Jacqueline.
Follow-up question. If we want consumer member to be involved, then is the consumer member going to be required to look at all of them as opposed to the physicians, which may be required to look at 2? Secondly, while we're talking about 10 a month for this, we still haven't figured out what the other bucket is of number of reviews for cases that are going to be closed. So again, I'm looking at the aggregate here because that's where the work is going to fall. So that's, and the last thing I want to know is on this list of resolutions, Dr. Feibel had brought up, let's carve out licensure and renewal. Okay. Are there any other buckets we can carve out here? If they're kind of like, not really relevant, why are we throwing them in? Care back on those too. So that's my last question.
Yeah, so to address your first question, I think we have with this FSMB recommendations committee, we have 2 separate proposals that I think maybe we're mixing a little. So the introduction of the consumer member was to that investigations process. With respect to ongoing quality assurance, I think we would envision that differently to say it is its own standing committee, and we would select committee members for that standing committee. It does not have to be the same consumer member, although it is recommended by FSMB that it includes a consumer member. So it doesn't have to be the same as the one in the investigations process. In fact, I would recommend that it's not the same. So we're diversifying that view.
No, I totally understand. I'm just trying to understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. That's all. It's going to fall on myself, Betty, or Mr. Gunnadock. So I'm just trying to understand what's the pool here. So again, I'm not opposed. I'm just trying to understand what the time commitment is.
Sure.
So I would have said, Bob, that it would be a lot to ask of a consumer member to review every one of the 10 cases. I think that we still ultimately get where we want to go by having a consumer member involved in the process. So I think that it is still very legitimate to simply have the consumer member review the maybe 2 or so, per month, along with the other physician members of the committee reviewing roughly 2 charts a month. I think that there is still involvement in that regard.
Okay, thanks.
Pleasure.
And Dr. Schottenstein, whether or not we did it quarterly or monthly makes no difference. If you did 10 and there was only, I suppose it gives you an early warning system, I guess, if you do it monthly. So, it's 6 1/2 dozen of the others, I guess.
Well, I guess the question is, how often should we get the charts and how often should we meet, right? There's 2 different questions. I think that it's actually reasonable to meet quarterly. I think it probably is excessive to meet every month because essentially what we're going to be reviewing is an aggregate amount of data, right? So there's no reason why we can't review 90 days worth of data, every 90 days. But as to the charts, and maybe each board member would want his or her own thought on the matter, I would just as soon get the charts every month,
Amen.
and that way it sort of keeps me rolling,
Right.
as opposed to, getting 2 charts a month instead of 6 at once every 90 days.
Sneaking these in at the last minute when we don't have time to get it all done.
Exactly. So we have a decision point where we, are to decide how many cases, how many complaints for review each month. If the 10 approximately represents what the previous committee did, I'm comfortable with that if that's comfortable for everybody. Okay. All right. So we'll say about 10 a month to be distributed among committee members, if that's okay. And then as to committee membership, the previous Quality Assurance Committee consisted of 4 physician members. There has, of course, been a recommendation by FSMB for inclusion of a consumer member. So I guess what I was thinking is, either 3 physician members plus a consumer member, or even 4 physician members plus a consumer member. If we did the 4 physician members plus a consumer member, that's our 5, and that's 2 each, right? And that's sort of a nice round number, sort of distributes the workload a little bit if we can essentially get, those volunteers, if we have enough people, up for participating. That was my thought. Any discussion? Yes, sir. Dr. Feibel.
I would do 4 physician members and 1 consumer member so that it's 2 apiece per month. I think that seems like a comfortable number and easy to dispense out.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's my thought. Dr. Bechtel, yes, sir.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Feibel's opinion. 4 physicians or healthcare providers and then 1 consumer member. It'll be interesting too because the amount of time spent reviewing these cases can be highly variable. There may be one that you review that's a slam dunk case that takes 5 minutes. It's just very obvious. There may be another one that could take an hour to review, or even more because it's very complicated, especially if it's a quality of care thing. So the amount of time spent reviewing these cases can be really variable. I'm talking to Bruce and Kim. They could probably let us know more, but it can be highly variable. It can be quick and it can be very, very time consuming. It'll be just a random selection too.
That's the question. Is it a random selection from those categories?
Yes, we would propose it be completely random. Mm-hmm.
Who decides that? I mean, who picks them out?
So we'll come up with some sort of, for lack of a better description, some sort of steward mechanism. It will be something that we can pull out of the sales.
Pull it out of it.
Yeah, we'll use some sort of algorithm in Salesforce to pull it.
Now, a question is, once they're sent out to each person on the committee, then they make a decision whether to continue it be closed or reopened. So then if it's closed, that's fine. If it's reopened, where does it go from that point? That's my first question. And then the second question is, it's going to be sort of a nightmare as to who reviewed it in order to prevent them from voting at the back end if it stays open.
Mm-hmm.
There's always Dr. Bechtel can't vote, Dr. Bechtel can vote, etc. So I'm just wondering, that's going to be a little bit of a nightmare.
Well, it'll just bear keeping track of it, and so yes, it will be more work, but it should ideally be the kind of thing that we can, keep track of. And in terms of the mechanism for the random selection of cases, a lot of us remember a time when the R&Rs were randomly assigned to board members for presentation. So I'm guessing it could be sort of a similar kind of situation, but this time for quality assurance committee members. Okay, and then I guess I had another question, Stephanie, which is, do you essentially ask for volunteers, right? In other words, do you go to the board and say, who'd like to be on the committee in terms of deriving the committee membership?
So that's how we've done other committees, and then the board president makes final determination if we have some conflicts or we have over volunteering or under volunteering. So yeah, I think that's always our starting point, is to say who's interested. You always get better results if you have interested participants.
Sure. Dr. Feibel.
Yeah, one other nitty gritty detail that I think would be helpful is if it is sent back to whoever, let's assume I review something. If it is sent back, I think I should be involved in that case from there on forth, because I can't be involved at the board level. So I think I should be involved in rounds on that. I don't think it's going to happen that often, but those cases certainly should have the input of as many people as possible that are allowed to input.
So you're sort of anticipating our next decision point under proposed process. So if we'll look toward the end of that paragraph, what we'll see is it states the complaint will then be presented. And again, this is if it is recommended to be reopened. The complaint will then will be presented to the secretary, supervising member, a consumer member, and the reviewing committee member for recommended next steps, enforcement or close. So I think that's the plan going forward, right? If there is a recommendation for reopen, is essentially there's a meeting of members. Dr. Rothenbaum.
So I don't think that that follows with what we just discussed as far as having the 4 physicians and 1 consumer member on the committee with each reviewing 2 charts. So I don't think that the consumer member would be involved with every chart that possibly comes back.
Well, what we're hoping, I think, is that there won't be many of those, right? In other words, hopefully there would just be a small number of complaints that are recommended for reopen. And so, hopefully it would not appreciably add to the workload of the consumer member, but I appreciate your point. Mr. Jacqueline, did you have a question as well?
I'm going back to the random assignment of may I make a suggestion, since we're all focused on the Strauss history here? If there's a sexual misconduct event, I think that should go to the consumer member. And there probably shouldn't be many because we're like you said, we're straining them out. But to the extent there are, that way there's no dispute, it should probably go to the consumer member.
So in other words, every closed sexual misconduct case.
Audit process. If it's a sexual misconduct,
it's the audit.
Except we already have a consumer member involved in that. So I don't think that's as necessary because that consumer member is going to be involved in the re-adjudication of that case. So
yeah, but we've got a lot
Two different things here.
Yeah, that on the front end, you're right, and eventually we'll get to the point where that's not necessary. But we're doing an audit function that predated the consumer member's involvement.
Yeah, I take your point.
right.
Yeah.
Cases, I'm fine with that. Future cases where there is a consumer member involved, I think it will be done randomly because, I think it can be done randomly.
Yeah, I agree.
I think you want as much input as you can on the board is from as many different perspectives as you can.
Yeah. And again, if the consumer member is involved on the front end, there's no need to have them involved on the back end or she. I'm just talking about the events where there was none. That's the one where, we historically have got criticism. Mm-hmm. Let's alleviate that criticism on the front and the back end. That's all. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail your conversation.
No, you're very kind to bring that up. So, Stephanie, what's your thought about that? Essentially prioritizing the sexual misconduct closed cases for committee review.
So I think that Bob raises a good point. And I think we've run into some of this ourselves with internal process where we've created something new and we sort of run into the donut holes. So I think that until we're running with the full consumer member involvement, I think that addresses we saw that very consistently in the FSMB recommendations. Have a consumer member put eyes on the sexual misconduct. I think until we catch up with ourselves with respect to closes that the consumer member has been involved in, I think it does make sense if we pull those to direct those to the consumer member. Then we're meeting, we're closing that donut hole.
I really agree. I think it's a great idea.
I'm sorry, your QA process I'm sorry, Dr. Schottenstein, your QA process, your audit process, if there is random except for assignment to consumer members, on the consumer member on the committee for sexual abuse cases, sexual misconduct cases, which have been closed. Random except for sexual misconduct would go to the consumer member of the committee. Right? Is that summarizing correctly what your suggestion?
So in other words, not only would we prioritize all the closed sexual misconduct committee, all the closed sexual misconduct cases coming to the committee, but also those cases would be shunted to the consumer member of the committee. Am I sort of getting you right there?
I thought that was just a random selection of cases.
Well, so what Bob is...
Some of them were sexual misconduct. And if there are, we're dipping into the sexual misconduct pool. And those that we dip into need to go to consumer member. Is that what you're saying?
So what I thought I heard Bob propose is basically it's random except we prioritize the sexual misconduct cases. So any closed sexual misconduct cases come to the committee. And then essentially a random sampling of whatever is left over. So if let's say there's 2 or 3 sexual misconduct cases that were closed in a month, we get those. And then the other 7 are randomly generated from the rest of our closed cases. And then that also, though, I think begs that good question, right? Which is, when those sexual misconduct cases come to the QA committee, do those cases go to the consumer member, like by default, or are they randomly distributed to the committee as well?
I guess you guys have jumped me on this one. My comment was simply, if they're coming through the door, the consumer member gets dibs on the sexual misconduct ones that come through.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I'm saying in some ways.
You put a bolus of sexual misconduct cases through the door. I'm just saying, as they come, those the consumer member.
Well, I don't understand your language. Is Robert? Are you saying come? It's either pre-close or post-close. Post-close is where the quality assurance.
In the audit process, right? We're going to get X amount of cases. Out of those X amount of cases, Y will be sexual misconduct. May not be none, but it may be Y. If it's Y, those go to the consumer member for review and comment. Okay, because again, a criticism has been no consumer member involvement in the sexual misconduct things. So we're doing this a back-end audit. We're saying in the audit process, we default for sexual misconduct cases to the consumer member for review, and that's how we take care of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. Stephanie, what's your thought about that? You comfortable with that?
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, though, that we will not be sending every closed sexual misconduct case to the Quality Assurance Committee, because if we do that, you won't pull any other samples. If a sexual misconduct case gets pulled, it gets directed to the consumer member.
Correct.
Oh, okay. So in other words, then we're back to sexual misconduct being part of the random sample.
Correct.
But the random sample is narrowed to those areas. We're not looking at everything the board does. We're looking at narrow categories. We're looking at standards. We're looking at sexual misconduct. We're looking at, it goes back to the original question I had, is what are we not looking at, you know? Mm-hmm. So as long as we have the priority cases being audited where we can get into trouble, and we're not dealing with anything licensure, and not that those aren't important, but we don't get into as much, there's not so much danger to the public, perhaps.
So we're back to random sample, right? Without per se prioritizing sexual misconduct for the random sample. But when there is a sexual misconduct case that is randomly pulled, it goes to this consumer member. That's sort of where we're landing. Okay, great. So in the interest of time, if you'd be so kind, I'll just ask, with regard to the proposed process, we have it sort of laid out for us in terms of the Salesforce utilization and how the information is going to be, presented to the committee member, having already been reviewed by the secretary and supervising member, and then the committee member will, fill out the quality assurance tool, and then either recommend continued close or reopen. Any other discussion regarding that process?
But Michael, one question.
Yes, sir.
If we get the case and we have questions, is it inappropriate or appropriate to approach the secretary and supervising member via clarification?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I probably would have said that you use your own internal deliberation, right? Because there's the possibility of, sway, essentially. I do appreciate your point, which is it would be nice to know sort of where the secretary and supervising member were coming from. But ideally, we're trying to take an independent view. And essentially what's going to happen, I think, if we go back to secretary and supervising member, is it's going to sway us, essentially, to keep the case closed. And so what I would say then is, if on your own, you determine something should be reopened, remember, then there is that subsequent meeting, which will include the secretary and the supervising member. And I would say in that meeting, you could then ask questions of that nature that may, give you more understanding.
Michael,
Ms. Montgomery, yeah.
One of the things that you may also need to have in that meeting, besides the secretary and supervising member and the reviewer, is, do you need to have somebody from enforcement or investigations or someone to lay out the legal, because what's happened is Dr. Rothermel and Dr. Safran are being advised legally about they're taking, here's what we have, here's what we can achieve. We may want to do X, but we only have evidence to do Y. And so they have to make these tough choices. We sit back, we look at it and say, well, why did they do that? And what we're doing is they're relying upon information supplied by the lawyers. I think, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong. And either that or you have Angela in it, or somebody who can illuminate, because it's not fair. When we review a case, we don't know what Dr. Rothermel and Dr. Safran have been told when they close a case. We don't know what decisions they've had to make between, okay, here's what the law says. We think they did X, but we can only prove Y. Dr. Safran, Dr. Rothermel, what should we do? So they make a recommendation. We get it and we double them. Well, how could you possibly do that? Because we don't know what they've been told. And we don't know if legally, we just don't know. So it seems to me that last piece has to include either a lawyer or our enforcement people or Angela or somebody that can bring that piece of information in, because it's not really fair to these two silent members. It's not fair because we're always second guessing them because we don't know what they're being told.
I think it's a great point. And ideally, even if we could get the investigator or the enforcement attorney who was part of that decision making in the first place, there's no reason to have to sort of reinvent the wheel and give the case to a brand new attorney, so to speak. If we could sort of pull somebody who had hands on the case for that meeting, I think that would really, be great.
I think it's twofold. I think it's staffing and I think it's documentation, right? And so this is something I've talked with secretary and supervising member about. I think we can as staff, I think we can up our game on presentation of materials in a more standard, better documented fashion. And I hope that would facilitate some of the review in and of itself. But I do think working with the staff members who are involved, I think it facilitates both a feedback loop to staff as well as being able to provide, bigger context of what may or may not have happened in the review.
Yeah, the feedback loop is really important because your staff then gets really engaged with the board. Okay, what is the board expecting and what are you doing with your case? What are you presenting to these two members? They have to make tough decisions and we don't all know what they're saying, what they're being told.
Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes. I want to make sure that we get through our agenda. So if I may, I just sort of want to circle back then to our last item, which is the proposed quality assurance tool. It's laid out for us in terms of the complaint intake process disposition, and then the committee member assessment. Does anybody have any questions about how that is laid out? Yes, Ms. Montgomery.
You'd expect this. I'm sorry to be so chatty today.
It's my pleasure.
I think on the tool, I hope you'll have on the tool some kind of, has it been referred to law enforcement somewhere, or has there been an evaluation of the potential must reports, meaning in the course of doing this case, are there docs that are supervising docs that didn't report this? And in the course of our investigation, do we determine that? And perhaps that should be included. And obviously, Nathan and company can work their magic in terms of sort of repackaging the format a bit, massaging it a bit. I think the format is a little clunky, but generally it's a great start.
So from a format perspective, we have really good experience of creating the template within Salesforce. And we did that with our expert reviewers with the 1,250 cases that we reviewed. They had the case file, it was packaged for them. They had all of the materials, and they had a template screen in Salesforce that they were able to then fill out. And so I think what we can do maybe for the next meeting is even come up with a mock-up of what that template looks like and include some of these fields, sort of give you a feel for what that workflow process would look like from a logistics perspective. And then maybe if you have additional thoughts on fields that should be included, we can, you can email those to me. We can also email out what the external reviewers looked at in the historical case review. I think that they hit some of Ms. Montgomery's points, and it seemed to be a good process once we had training. That would be the other thing that I would say, is that I think we fully acknowledge that there's a training piece from the system side, and also some education from the participant side as to how the reviews happen. So I think that is, we don't want to throw anybody into the deep end, or Lake Erie, as Dr. Safran likes to reference.
Good. Any other business for today?
I just wanted to...
Oh, sorry, Dr. Safran, yes.
No, go ahead.
Well, this is the same thing I brought up earlier, but in the proposed process, I still have a question on the last point, Michael or Dr. Schottenstein, regarding having the review be done with a consumer member in addition to the person who was randomly assigned to review that case. Because if I'm not reading this incorrectly, which you can correct me if I am, but it sounds like every case that's reviewed that is recommended to be reopened will have a consumer member on that group that looks at it once it's reopened. And that means that the consumer member is going to review each of those cases where they may not have been assigned to that case. I just don't think it's a place where I see a consumer member has to be involved with each of those cases. I think the member on the review committee that's been assigned to that case should be involved. But I don't see why the consumer member would have to be involved with every one.
Yeah, fair enough. Dr. Safran?
And just to piggyback on what Betty said, why can't the people on the review committee speak to the investigator, speak to the attorney beforehand to make the decision and get the information that we had, and that may prevent them from carrying it on to be reopened if they have more information. So it might cut down the number of cases that are brought to this committee to discuss. I mean, if they're going to be able to talk to them, why can't they do it prior to the group meeting?
So if there's, confidence that those communications can take place and that, it would not, how shall I say, bias the reviewer, then I think by all means that's the right thing to do, right? I think that's sort of the question, right? But yeah, if everybody's comfortable, with that
they're not
process.
talking to us. They're not talking to Kim and I. They're talking to the other people that assisted Kim and I. So therefore, they're going to get the same information. They're not going to be biased. I mean,
so to talk to the staff.
Staff.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. That makes sense. Does that feel comfortable for everybody? Yeah. Dr. Feibel?
We're making the assumption here that the secretary and the supervising member are quote unquote the problem here. I don't think that's the case. And I think an independent review is good without having anyone involved, just looking at the data. And the worst that happens is we have to open up some cases. And what's the big deal about that? This should be as pure a process as possible. And to me, going back to the investigator or the enforcement attorney, you're going to get bias involved because they were involved in the rounds and they heard what the secretary and supervising member said. They heard what the enforcement attorney said. And I think we want as pure a review as possible. And so I don't see a problem with the worst that happens is it takes a little bit of time, and I realize it, and I'm not minimizing people's time, but it educates all the members. There's more to this than that. So they look at the case pure, say it needs to be reviewed. They go back and review it and are told some more facts, and it's closed. If that happens, that's a great thing, in my opinion, in some respects. So I don't think we need to look at it as a bad thing that these cases are being re-reviewed. I think we need to look at it as a belt on suspenders type of thing. And I don't think it's the supervised member that are the problem, and I don't think the enforcement attorneys or the other people are a problem. But I think we need to just have as pure a process as possible.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's a point well taken. And you'll forgive me, I know we're running short on time. It's 10:02, right? So I think that it's all really good feedback. For the record, I don't think anybody is the problem per se. This is just about, building quality assurance into the process. That's all. So as we're running late on time, is there anything else quickly before we break?
So I will just say, well, how about we work on the tool and we come back with a demo for the next time? And just quickly to Dr. Feibel's point on the peer review, that is how the external reviewers did that for the historical case review. And then those came back through if they were recommended, and then staff members opined and then weighed in on that sort of thing. So I think that process was a little more efficient, and from a staff time perspective, I think that worked well, and it still left plenty of opportunity for discussion, as Dr. Rothermel and Dr. Safran know, because they are still wading through that.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for such a nice discussion. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Dr. Rothermel and Dr. Safran, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
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 Thanks again, everybody. See you soon.
All right, thanks.